Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. It's exciting to have a big group. On January 7th, two brothers, Saeed and Sharif Kouachi, forced their way into the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo. Armed with assault rifles, they barged into the lobby and killed their first victim, a maintenance worker. They then proceeded to force a woman to bring them up to the second level of the offices of Charlie Hebdo, where a group of 15 workers were having an editorial meeting. They walked in the front door of that room, shot the bodyguard, and then called out the name of the chief editor of Charlie Hebdo. They wanted to target him first. Over the next 5 to 10 minutes, they killed 10 individuals in that office space. As they were leaving, they wounded and ultimately executed up close a police officer, a French police officer. Witnesses said as they were leaving the scene, they were screaming, "We have avenged the Prophet Muhammad. We have killed Charlie Hebdo." Now, I'm sure many of you have been following this debate. And in the aftermath of this first attack, a friend of the Kouachis carried out a second attack, killing another police officer and 4 individuals at a Jewish deli in Paris. In total, 17 individuals were killed. Now, Charlie Hebdo is a satirical newspaper that is intentionally trying to be provocative. It wants to push you. Its issues are intentionally and regularly anti-religion. They mock all religions, although more recently they've been focusing their efforts on Islam and targeting Islam, portraying pictures of Muhammad, which most Muslims agree is either in violation of Islam or just in bad taste. So this is an important issue. And for those of you, most of you have been following this debate closely, I think it's an important issue to get us to think about what's happening in our world. This isn't the first incident where free speech and Islam have butted heads. There are many examples of that. But this feels different. This feels as if we've been picked up and pitched forward, that we've entered a new world. What I'm calling blasphemy has been globalized. Right? So the globalization of blasphemy. And now blasphemy has been around a long time. Ever since we've had conceptions of God, there's been somebody around writing rules about, well, how we should talk about those gods, right? There's a long history of that. In Greece, in ancient Greece and in ancient Romans, you were free to criticize the political system, but don't say anything negative about the gods. Even in the United States, the bastion of free speech, we have a long history of blasphemy laws. This is my favorite. This is from 1697 in Massachusetts. And here we go. This is a law against blasphemy. What I thought was really interesting is down here it says, everyone offending shall be punished for a time not exceeding 6 months. That seems pretty reasonable. But if you keep reading, there's this, like later in the sentence, there's this conversation about whipping, boring through the tongue with the hot iron, and firing upon the gallows with the rope around their necks. If I was in Massachusetts in 1697, I would ask for some clarification on this. There seems to be some inconsistency in that final punishment sentence. All right. So again, there's nothing new with blasphemy. But for most of history, states have determined and enforced those laws. So the United States would create its own blasphemy laws, and they would enforce those laws, just as France or Russia or Saudi Arabia or Malaysia or Indonesia or Nigeria would come up with their own laws and say, this is our laws, they're enforceable within our states. The Charlie Hebdo attack changes that, and it globalizes the enforcement. It globalizes and it decentralizes who's enforcing blasphemy. Think about Charlie Hebdo. They're a small, relatively insignificant global actor. The weekly circulation of Charlie Hebdo before the attack was around 60,000 issues. By comparison, the Chicago Tribune, their weekly circulation is 400,000. So many of you probably never heard of Charlie Hebdo before. But nevertheless, this organization, this institution, became a global actor and targeted for what it was saying. I think there are 2 elements of globalization that help us understand why blasphemy has been globalized. The first is an obvious one, technology. Think about what's happening here, right? Think about when you're on Twitter, when you're on Facebook, when you're writing a news article or reading a news article. There are no longer boundaries for that speech. Speech has gone truly global and can reach every corner of the world. This is a fundamental and dramatic change. Think about these tip talks. So in about a week or so, we'll take the video of these Tip Talks and we're going to upload them to YouTube. And Tip Talk fans all over the world can watch. Now you're laughing, right? But I did some research. I got on our YouTube page and started looking to see who was watching our tapes or our videos around the world. And we've had, of course, we start in North Central. We've had people in the United Kingdom. We've had people in Sweden, Ukraine, and the Philippines watch Tip Talks, right? I think that's pretty fascinating. Hashtag Swedes love Tip Talks. So speech has been globalized. And we can't constrain that. So that means that what we say and what people hear is everywhere around the world. The other factor, which is important, is not only has speech been globalized, we've been globalized. Human beings have been globalized, particularly in Western liberal democracies. Think about the countries that we live in right now. We're no longer a monolithic culture defined by one race, one religion, one ethnicity. We're a big melting pot. And that means that we've got lots of people taking part in a conversation about how we should refer to our gods, what's appropriate and inappropriate language. So those two dynamics, the idea of changing speech and the idea of us being globalized, has fundamentally changed the world. Let's go back and think a little bit about the Kouachi brothers, the individuals who carried out that attack on Charlie Hebdo. So they were two young men. They were French nationals of Algerian descent. They were Muslims being raised in a traditionally Christian country. They were radicalized through a local mosque that had ties to insurgents in Iraq fighting Americans. Right? So think about that again. So French nationals, Algerian descendants, they were orphans, Muslims raised in a Christian country, radicalized at a local mosque with connections to insurgents fighting Americans in Iraq. Right? That's globalization. Not necessarily a good part of globalization, but it absolutely is. So our world has changed, and I think we need to rethink about what that means, especially when we talk about this divide between the sacred and the secular. Too often we get caught in this overly simplistic frame, which says there's part of the world which is secular, and we believe in free speech. It's the modern secular West. And at the other side of the world is the sacred, the backward religious extremism. This is dangerous, and I would argue that we need to reject this frame, because the reality is the modern secular West is struggling with conceptions of what is profane, what is blasphemous. We are having the same type of conversations that those that we would generally consider to be in this camp of the sacred. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at some of the legal traditions. Laws shifted to no longer protect Christianity, but instead to protect all religions. So there was this shift from speech against Christianity to be careful to say we need to respect all languages, all religions. And so a good example of the general trend we've seen in Western liberal democracies after World War II is the Irish Defamation Act of 2009. Talking about blasphemy, right? And you probably say, wow, Western liberal democracies, they're not having blasphemy. They are. And how they talk about it is very important. So blasphemous. So any person who publishes or utters blasphemous matter shall be guilty of an offense, and the fine should not exceed 25,000 euros. That's pretty significant, right? But now what constitutes blasphemy? So we have to jump down here. He or she publishes or utters matter that is grossly abusive or insulting in relation to matters held sacred by any religion. This is important. And thereby causing outrage among a substantial number of the adherents to that religion. So we're seeing an important shift here, right? Any religion, not just Christianity, any religion, but also the idea that we're alienating religious persons. So this idea is we're protecting religious persons, not necessarily religion. Let's compare that to Pakistan. And this is the current law in the books for Pakistan, the Penal Code for blasphemy. Use of derogatory remarks in respect to the Holy Prophet, whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by visible representation, or by imputation, innuendo, insinuation, very detailed, directly or indirectly defiles the sacred name of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, shall be punished with death or imprisonment for life, and shall also be liable to a fine. So we see some differences, but we also see some similarities here. Let's look at the two side-by-sides. The Irish law, which again is typical of many Western liberal democracy, is protecting religious persons. as opposed to the Pakistani law, which is protecting religion. Right? So are we protecting religious persons, or are we protecting religion? So there are differences, right? I mean, the death penalty versus a fine, a major difference. But also, both sides are trying to protect religion. There is some agreement that there should be limits on what we say about religion. There's a consensus there. I think that's important. We too often think about this clean divide between the secular and the sacred. I would argue that the secular are also grappling with how we protect religions. This is also happening at the international level. So here's a picture of a UN resolution. For 12 years, the Organization of Islamic Countries pushed for a resolution calling it the defamation of religions, which would have been an international law preventing any type of criticism of religions. This was a coordinated, well-funded effort. The United States was actively involved in this debate, but we weren't trying to kill the resolution. We wanted to change it. We wanted to shift it to reflect this idea of protecting religious persons. So it went from being called defamations of religions to combating intolerance, negative stereotyping, and stigmatization of, and discrimination, incitement, this is the title, to violence and violence against persons, right? So protecting religious persons. Throughout the text of the law, over and over again, you see this language, violence against persons, discrimination against persons. So the way the United States worked this out is to say, yes, we agree with the resolution that's pursuing this, but we want to make sure that we're protecting religious persons, not religion in general. So again, I come back to this point. It's not this clean divide between the sacred and the secular. There is a consensus that there should be some protection. And I think this presents us with a challenge. We need to think about the implications of this. We live in a very exciting world. If you are someone who wants to push the boundaries of speech, if you want to challenge free speech and continue to push what we consider to be acceptable, let's call you the outrageous. This is a great time to be alive. You can spread your word everywhere, to every corner of the world. There are very few limits on what you can say. But at the same time, there's another group who's trying to curb your right to say those things. Let's call them the outraged. And they both coexist. They also feel unchained. They feel that this is a wonderful time to be alive because they can take efforts to limit the outrageous. So what we have is what Jacques Berlinblow calls a profanity loop. The outrageous and the outraged are feeding off each other. They're creating a world that is very, very dynamic. And I put pictures of the conventional outraged, right? So the angry, the Karachi brothers, individuals who are using violence. There are also groups who are nonviolent in the category of the outraged. You could talk about the Organization of Islamic Countries, which wants to push laws against religious defamation. I think you could also put the Western liberal democracies, who are trying to say there should be some limits on what we say about religion in that category. And this presents a big challenge, especially for those of us living in Western liberal democracies where free speech has been such an important part of our historical development. How do we balance this new shift? How do we create a political environment that is open, tolerant, and embraces diversity? The diversity of all different types of religions, while at the same time preserving a dynamic free speech environment that allows us to criticize the very same social norms we want to celebrate. That's a really difficult thing to do. I'm not quite sure how we can deal with that, but I think it's a question that we need to grapple with, and I think for the most part, we've ignored it. As a way of thinking about how we might do this, I'm going to close with a story about a guy named Abner Neeland. Probably don't know Abner. He's a pretty interesting guy. He was the last last guy persecuted under Massachusetts blasphemy laws. In 1834, he wrote 3 articles. He published them in his own newspaper, and he was brought up on charges of blasphemy for alleging about the irrationality of Christianity. I think Abner would have been a fun guy to go have a beer with. And this quote from a minister who was in the area, I think, reinforces that. He says, Abner was jugged for 60 days, but he'll come out as beer from a bottle, all foaming, and will make others foam. We can think about people who are like that, who are always pushing the debate, always challenging us. And what I think is if you dive into what he was criticizing and his critique of Christianity, there was a lot more there. It wasn't just a blanket critique of Christianity. He was pushing for marriage equality, for birth control, he was anti-slavery, workers' rights, public education, racial equality, and gender equality. In 1834. Oh, Abner was a troublemaker, right? But I think as we grapple with how are we in a multicultural society going to balance the right to free speech with being culturally tolerant, we need to think about individuals like Abner and the important role they played in pushing us, in being intellectually rigorous and challenging norms while at the same time we respect those norms. This is a big challenge, and I hope we move to confront it. Thank you.